So if I may have everyone's attention, we are, I believe, ready to begin our next panel. I will introduce myself. I'm John Shattuck. I'm the president of Central European University in Budapest, and I have the great privilege to have been at the Forum 2000 events when they were just beginning, when I was serving some 14 years ago as the U.S. ambassador to the Czech Republic, and Forum 2000 was emerging as a major international forum. And probably my greatest privilege, of course, was to be able to know and to listen to directly, and in several instances to introduce President Václav Havel, who was then, of course, President of the Czech Republic. This panel is going to examine the value-based foreign policy that Václav Havel felt strongly about. And let me introduce the subject just by saying a few words about his thoughts on this subject. Forum 2000 itself is, in a sense, an implementation of Václav Havel's belief in the importance of values in governance. And what we will look at today, of course, is the way in which governance and questions of values affect or should affect, in many instances do not affect, foreign policy. And I think what we want first to look at is what is meant by value-based foreign policy. And let me quote from Havel himself on this subject in his Summer Reflections of 1991. He said, "Our policies, foreign and domestic, must grow out of ideas, above all, out of the idea of human rights as understood by modern humanity. Human rights are universal and indivisible. Human freedom is also indivisible. If it is denied to anyone in the world, it is therefore denied indirectly to all people. This is why we cannot remain silent in the face of evil or violence. Silence merely encourages these." That's a rather strong statement that we have from Václav Havel at the beginning of his presidency. So I would like to ask a second question, which he also answers, and which is, how does this value-based approach toward foreign policy relate to the reality of what actually goes on between countries and in the international sphere? How does it relate to fundamental issues of war and peace, compromise, and the ability to work toward solutions for all of humanity as well as for national interest, which of course is what he was talking about? Here too, let me refer to President Havel's opinion on that subject, his statement. He said, "Clearly, a dissident intellectual who philosophizes in his study about the fate and future of the world has different opportunities, a different position, a different kind of freedom than a politician who moves among the complicated social realities of a particular time and place, constantly coming up against the intractable and contradictory issues and interests that inhabit that time and space. But a person who is sure of the values he believes in and struggles for, who knows he simply cannot betray them, is usually better able to recognize the degree of compromise permissible in the practical application of his ideals, and to know when a risk becomes more than he should take on himself." So you can see he is wrestling with this question of reality. So I think what we will do on this panel is to wrestle with the question of reality today in terms of value-based approaches toward international relations and foreign policy, and very specifically, what kinds of decisions should be made and should be taken by those who practice value-based foreign policy, or those who advocate it for governments that they are trying to persuade to take those positions. decisions, for example, toward those issues of democratic movements from Euromaidan to Hong Kong and beyond that are seeking greater democracy in various forms. Approaches toward those who are autocratic in their approach toward governance, but may claim to be operating as democrats because they have been elected in a democratic election. Or third, violent conflicts in many parts of the world today, which involve both states and non-state actors, and obviously are deeply destructive to human rights and democracy. How should a value-based foreign policy or approach toward foreign policy and international relations look at these kinds of issues? We have a broadly diverse, wonderful international panel here, and I will now be silent for most of the rest of this because you're going to hear from them. And I thought we might begin by calling upon Carl Gershman, who's seated over here to my far right, to your left, who is the president of the National Endowment for Democracy and oversees a great deal of work of the endowment in support of democratic movements worldwide, based in Washington, of course. And I can add that Carl and I have known each other for over 50 years since we went to university together. So, Carl, let me start with you and see if you can provide some elucidation to what President Havel meant by value-based foreign policy today.
Thanks, John. It's so great to be here this morning, and I just want to say what a thrill it is to see Alice Bialiatski. And I know that were Havel here, he would be thrilled as well because he nominated you for the Nobel Peace Prize, and you didn't get it, but you're free. And obviously there's a big struggle still to be waged in Belarus, and how great it is to be here with Yoani and everyone else. Havel, was someone who believed very deeply in values, but he was not, just an idealist. He was also very much a realist. When we, in 2009, we helped organize an Eastern Partnership conference in Lviv, to which Havel made introductory remarks. This was 2009 in Ukraine. And he said at the time that if economic interests are placed above human rights, it's suicidal. And at a recent conference in Kiev, the Ukrainian philosopher Miroslav Marinovich said that if values are sacrificed for security, you're going to lose both. And I'm very, very concerned about the situation today. Our good friend, the Washington journalist Jackson Deal, has an article today in the Washington Post that I urge you to look at. It was just sent to me, where he's talking about really the retreat of the Visegrad countries, each of the four countries, in terms of retreating before Putin's very aggressive advances in one way or another, and he traces the different steps of this retreat. And the question we all confront is, how do we deal with this problem? Havel's point of view was really based upon a particular historical experience, the experience of Nazism, and then the experience of communism. So he experienced totalitarianism firsthand, and he struggled against it. He knew what it was. And I think that obviously shaped his point of view. But as we've already heard in the session that came before us, young people today don't have the same experience. So how can you educate about what Ramin Jahanbegloo called this passion for democracy without that historical experience, with a different historical experience today? It's not very easy, because I don't think that without these values of human dignity, of freedom, and defending human dignity and freedom, that you can have the will to carry out a strong foreign policy, or the determination, or even the geopolitical strategy. Because if you don't know where you're going and what you have to defend, how are you going to develop a strategy? Because Putin has a strategy. But how are you going to develop a strategy in defense against that unless it's rooted in values? Now, I don't have any simple answers as to how you do this. But the first thing I'll say is that what we did last night with the Forum 2000 meeting, with Khodorkovsky, with Igor's very moving introduction to last night, is the beginning of educating a new generation about these values. And then you have the need, as Igor pointed out last night, which I think is really critical, of connecting people in the United States, in the democratic countries of the world, where, yes, they become unhappy with democracy, but to connect them with the people who are struggling for democracy in Belarus and in Cuba and in Tibet. To connect with people who are on the front lines of these struggles, because they have that understanding. And then they can transmit that understanding, and that you can try to cultivate a relationship and an attitude of democratic solidarity. We heard this morning that Ramin was talking about how he had read Havel, whereas a lot of people in this country had not. And I can remember when we had an event at the Library of Congress with dissidents with Havel in 2007. One of the Iranian participants in that meeting rushed up to Havel after the meeting and said, "Can we have your permission to translate into Farsi The Power of the Powerless and to put it on our website so that the Iranian movement could have that?" So there is a kind of a two-way process. There is a process of people who are struggling, learning from people who have had a certain experience like Havel, and then there is the process of people in the established democracies somehow trying to draw upon the spirit of people who are on the front lines of the democratic struggle. And one last point. We may have to be grateful to Putin for giving us a wake-up call, for reminding us that you can't have a vacation from history. We thought in the 90s in the US there was a vacation from history. It doesn't work that way. The forces that are against the values that Havel stood for, that I think Forum 2000 stands for, that we stand for, they're not going to go away. And if you allow them an opening, whether it's in this region with Russia, whether it's in the Middle East with ISIS, I worry about Asia and China and other places. If you allow the opening, if you create a vacuum, that vacuum will be filled by some very bad people. So in the end, in thinking about values, what really it means is that you need an integrated approach. Yes, you've got to defend economic interests. Yes, you obviously have security interests. But unless you have an underlying value structure which indicates what it is all about, why you have to defend not only your own country, but your own values, your own civilization, because if you don't, they're going to be threatened. And as Havel suggested, it would be suicidal to walk away from a defense of your basic values for whatever reason, because you need oil or the economic interests. You're going to suffer. And I think that, reviving that integrated approach, I think, is the very highest priority today, not just in Europe, not just in Central Europe, but also in the United States as well.
Thank you, Carl. And I think you've posed a very challenging question to the rest of the panel. which is how it is that you make sure that values are not sacrificed for other interests, because if you do, you'll lose both the values and the other interests. But I think many members of our panel are on the front lines in various ways. And I think it would be useful to hear the perspective, as you put it, from the people who are out there struggling for their values and for broader issues, and they're not quite sure, perhaps, what kind of assistance is most valuable from abroad. So let me turn, if I may, to all the way to the far left here, to Alex Bialiatski, who is the founder and chair of the Viasna Human Rights Center in Belarus, a very widely respected international human rights leader, was released from prison in June of this year. As he said, he was put in prison for political reasons and no doubt was released for political reasons. He's received international recognition, including the Lech Walesa Award and many others. So, Mr. Bialiatski, if you could reflect a little bit on the way in which values are promoted by yourself and those who are trying to assist you. What kind of assistance is most helpful to you?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I will speak Russian. First, we've met with Václav Havel 2 times in my life. First time when he was a president, and for the second time when he already was not a president. But what I was really interested in, that he always attentively followed the situation with the human rights in Belarus and was always informed about what is happening there. And talking to him, I never felt a famous human rights activist. I rather spoke to him like a teacher with a student. Actually, he was taken as a teacher because what he did is something we can still only dream of, because this is the fight that we are leading in the Belarus Republic. It was not as successful as in the countries bordering with our country. And after these 25 years have passed, when the Czech Republic has changed its direction, but still in our country the fight keeps going on.
Которую я получил от Václava Havela, она пришла, когда я был уже в тюрьме. Он написал письмо поддержки, подписал его своим знаменитым сердечком этим. Но самое удивительное было для меня то, что я его получил тогда, когда его уже не было с нами. Это было последнее вообще письмо, которое он написал в своей жизни. Он написал письма в поддержку политических заключенных в Беларуси. И вот он умер, а это письмо я получил через 3 недели, уже зная, что его нет. И это было, конечно, для меня очень большое такое психологическое переживание, потому что я ощутил вот его, как бы вот эту энергию, которая шла, хотя его уже не было с нами. И меня всегда поражало в нем это большая человечность. Вот его все посты президентские, 2 срока президентства, никаким образом не отбились, но не оказали какое-то влияние на него, как на человека. Он всегда был абсолютно простой, абсолютно конкретный. И вот этот высокий пост не изменил его взгляды на жизнь, что мы достаточно часто видим в обыкновенной жизни. И порядочность, которая была в нем всегда, это, конечно, то, чего очень сильно не хватает при многих политических решениях, которые принимаются в последнее время. И его взгляды были, наверное, взглядами мечтателя в глазах реал-политиков. Но кто из них мог поверить 26 лет назад, например, что через год, в 1989 году, блок социалистических стран-сателлитов Советского Союза
would collapse. And 3 years later, the prison of people collapsed, the Soviet Union. And we don't know how the world would look like if people like Václav Havel didn't exist. And in my opinion, these two people, Václav Havel and President Putin, are very opposite to each other. And the Russian-Ukrainian war really stressed a lot of people in this region. And Ukrainian people, they rebelled against the corrupt power and stood for European values and proclaimed the Ukrainian dream as his own dream, as a European dream, as his personal dream. And the Ukrainians decided to build Europe on the basis of democracy, on the basis of human rights respect. And actually, the Ukrainian people tried to live the dream that Václav Havel used to dream. And money didn't matter, and non-divided power was not an option anymore. And the people were ready to do a lot in order to keep the power. And unfortunately, a lot of people decided to go for military actions in order to preserve power. And of course, we understand that for Russia, nowadays Ukraine that strives for democracy is not a pleasant neighbor. And the future of Ukraine is extremely important for our region, for Moldova, for Belarus. And the question is whether Ukraine will be able to stand, will be able to persist, and will be able to claim its freedom and to claim its right to be a part of Europe. And Azerbaijan is a mirror of Belarus. There is no free press there is no free election there, and there are political prisoners. And Ilham Aliyev, the president of Azerbaijan, is very welcome around the world, and now they actually they had the Council of Europe, and this country presides the Council of Europe, and to me it seems like an evil dream of history and real politics. And many people take dictators as infant rebels, and in my opinion this is no more than an illusion. In my opinion, this one moment lies. They belong to anti-democratic camp. And we do not want these double standards that apply to Azerbaijan are applied to Belarus. And Lukashenko takes Belarus as a third party, a neutral party in Russian-Ukraine conflict. And in Belarus, we have huge military bases, we have air defense, and we are very largely dependent on Russian economy. And Russian officials are independent to the extent Putin allows them to be independent. And authoritarian dictatorship cannot stand for freedom. To us, the fight for freedom and fight for democracy are inseparable. And I was released from prison, and I'm so thankful to people who tried to set me free, but I'm not the only political prisoner in Belarus, and many human rights activists are still under very heavy pressure in Belarus. People get detained, people get arrested, and the independent journalists are being prosecuted. And in spring, we hosted the World Championship in ice hockey in Minsk, in capital city of Belarus, and many people opposed this event due to political reasons. Nevertheless, the championship was successful in terms of sport activity, but a lot of people got detained during the championship, and the official reason was improper language. and their refusal to follow the police instructions. So many fans turned out to be in prison, and especially the Belarusian activists turned out to be in prison. So it became a nightmare for them. And to tell the truth, for many dictators, sport events became the meaning of how to build their image. And we have to point out that non-democratic regimes, they help each other. And they form new organizations like Eurasian Economic Society or Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and they really support each other. They never criticize Cuba, they never criticize China. On the contrary, the Belarusian regime has been always supported by similar regimes. And within these planetary dictatorships, how it has to be challenged by the community of people who cherish democracy, who cherish freedom, and who cherish the human rights. And I think that is what Václav Havel claimed to be the most important thing.
Thank you very, very much for those words from
Спасибо большое за эти слова.
Of the struggle for democracy. And I think as we move through the panel, I would like to have the panelists think about, from their own perspective, and I'm going to call on my colleague Andrew Schapiro next to do this. What is the appropriate role of foreign governments, and in this case the United States, in promoting democracy and human rights in the value approach? And then from the perspective of those like Mr. Bialiatski, what kind of assistance is most useful, and perhaps what kind of assistance is not useful? So let me introduce the U.S. ambassador to the Czech Republic. It's my great pleasure to do so, Andrew Schapiro, who has family roots in the Czech Republic. His mother grew up in Prague. He's a distinguished American lawyer, nominated by President Obama for the position of ambassador and confirmed by the United States Senate, which these days, given challenges of democracy in the United States, is no small feat. So, Ambassador Schapiro, maybe you could reflect on this issue.
Thank you. And I first want to say what a tremendous honor it is to be on a panel with people of this stature, many of whom have been out in the trenches, really risking all to pursue the values that we're talking about. Alex, you asked earlier, you said in your comments, if I understood the translation correctly, you said, we don't know how the world would look without people like Václav Havel. And I hope we never find out. I think we also don't know what the world would look like without nations that are willing to speak up about human rights, despite the very real risks and the tricky balancing act that you point out, Ambassador Shattuck. And that brings me back to what Carl Gershman started with, because it's something I'm feeling in my job here. How do you communicate to the next generation, one that doesn't remember 1968, let alone 1938, in a country like this, the importance of speaking up? And I feel that one of the first steps there is to answer and knock down what I see as a false choice. And each of you averted to this earlier. There is this idea out there, and it's overly facile and simplistic, that you have, on the one hand, a foreign policy that embraces values of human rights, and the caricature of that, and sometimes people will point to Woodrow Wilson or Jimmy Carter in a disparaging way, and they treat it as preaching and pointing fingers. And the caricature is that that's ineffectual. And that on the other side, some chest-thumping, pragmatic, real politic. But in preparing for this panel, I looked back at some of Havel's writings, because one of the first questions you posed to us is what is meant by a values-based foreign policy. And it's far more nuanced than that. And I think part of our job is to explain to the current generation what it means and why it's valuable. The Czech Republic does not have 10 aircraft carriers like the United States does. And the Czech Republic does not have a market of 1 billion consumers like China does. But the Czech Republic has had an inordinate influence around the world because of something else, because of its moral authority. And at the very end of the essay with which you opened, Ambassador Shattuck, from Václav Havel, President Havel wrote, "If Czechoslovakia, which it was at the time, enjoys the respect it does in the world today, then it is due, among other things, to the kind of basic decency and humanity with which communism was overthrown here and the moral direction of our foreign policy." So I think first we need to encourage people to think of a moral foreign policy as an asset, a resource, something that can be used to increase the influence of a country, especially a small country such as this one. Because if you think about the values that we care about, certainly the United States, deterring aggression, promoting the rule of law, combating corruption, strengthening democracies, preventing humanitarian crises, all of these things are easier when the countries you're dealing with on the world stage have open societies, have dissent, have free press, have freedom. Now I want to make a couple quick points about Havel and this false choice I was talking about. And, the first is that Václav Havel did not see pursuit of human rights as an inherently confrontational activity. To the contrary, he said at the EU Democracy Conference in 2009 that pointing out other countries' human rights failings does not mean we should have hostile relations with the nations of these countries or with their governments. It means forthrightness as the prime sign of friendship and the ability to discuss openly, tell each other what we like or dislike, what we consider or don't consider dangerous in one's actions, and what, on the other hand, we appreciate. So this idea first that for me as representative of the United States, or for the Czechs as representative of Havel's position, you need to be confrontational with other countries and bring up their human rights failings. That is not what Havel was pressing. He did say you cannot remain silent. Nor did he reject in some overly pure way having dealings with countries that might be described as bad actors. In fact, he said, and you have to unpack this sentence, but he said at one point, if somebody were to tell me, if you talk openly about my political prisoners, we will not give you any oil, then the only correct answer to this would be, keep your oil. But note what he did not say. He did not say, don't buy oil from countries that have bad human rights records. He said, if you will tell me I can't talk openly about your political prisoners. So there's the first idea is that it need not be confrontational. It need rather be a pursuit that takes as its core project open discussion. Secondly, Havel recognized the limits of a values-based foreign policy, and I think we need to as well. He said it's not usually a good idea to get out too far in front of the pack. And over the weekend, I watched this wonderful documentary that many of you in the room may have seen called Citizen Havel, Občan Havel, I think, that was recommended to me by some of the Czechs who work at the embassy. And it's magnificent, and it shows Havel grappling with exactly these limits as president of how to deal with, to be a pragmatist, but also be an idealist. But he said in a speech not too long before he died that the ability to judge whether we are about to make an inspiring step forward or instead are toying with fate and thus only arousing resistance in our partners is not the sole property of cool, calculating pragmatists. On the contrary, pragmatists tend to lack this quality. So I think part of what he was saying there in recognizing the limits is recognize the limits, but those of us who believe in human rights can at times trust our guts and take risks. And that brings me, I think, to my final point on this, and that's just to ask everyone to reflect, because I'm going to try to do this in my job. When people will say, but, you might offend someone. But, Washington might be unhappy with you if you say this. Think for a minute, everyone in this room, about a time when you feel that a government made a mistake by speaking out about a human rights issue. Hard to come up. Now think of a time when you think that a government made a mistake by being silent about an issue. You could probably rattle off a dozen. And I think we should bear that in mind as we decide how to act.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's very practical and sage advice from a new ambassador, and I know you'll have an opportunity to put much of your thoughts into play as you move through your tenure. We have two really remarkable activists, each in their own way, who remain to be heard on this panel. And I have almost a coin toss to think which to call first. They're both, so they have such inspiring stories. But I think, if I may, I'd like to call on Yoani Sánchez to now speak from the perspective of an internationally known and very successful blogger in her home country of Cuba. She has been translated, her blog, into some 20 languages. She speaks very directly. She has been called by a number of organizations, including Foreign Policy magazine, I noted, one of the world's top dissidents in 2010. So, and Yoani, of course, you are from Cuba, which has a very strained and long relationship in that regard with the United States. I'm not asking you to speak about that unless you wish. So the floor is yours, please.
Sí, buenos días a todos. Muchísimas gracias por la invitación a este panel. Gracias a los asistentes y especialmente a los activistas que han venido desde Cuba y están hoy aquí.
Good morning to you all. Thank you very much for having invited me to this panel, and thank you to all the speakers and especially to the activists who have come from Cuba to be here today.
Me he sentido muy feliz cuando conocí que el tema de este panel era el legado de Václav Havel en el tema de las relaciones internacionales y su proyección hacia el mundo, ¿no?
I was really happy to know that the topic of this panel was the heritage of Václav Havel in international relationships and its projection in the world.
Porque era yo adolescente cuando ocurrieron todos los sucesos que promovieron la transición democrática de muchos países de Europa del Este, desde autoritarismo, sistemas totalitarios, hacia las democracias imperfectas que tienen ahora, ¿no?
I was an adolescent when all the events that took place for the transition from these countries, from totalitarian governments to these imperfect democracies we have now, took place.
Y en ese momento fue muy importante para mi generación y para una generación muy amplia de disidentes y opositores cubanos poder tener acceso a las palabras de Václav Havel y contar con su apoyo y su solidaridad.
At that time, for my generation and for a whole generation of dissidents and people in the opposition, it was very important to have access to the words of Václav Havel.
Recuerdo que la primera vez que leí El poder de los sin poder, un libro totalmente prohibido en Cuba, leí un ejemplar pequeñito, forrado, con una página del periódico oficialista Granma, el periódico del Partido Comunista, para que nadie detectara lo que estaba leyendo, ¿no?
I remember the first time I read The Power of the Powerless. It was a small edition which was wrapped with a page of the newspaper Granma, the official newspaper of the Communist Party, so that nobody knew that I was reading that because it was forbidden.
Hasta el día de hoy el libro sigue prohibido en Cuba, ¿no?
Until today, it is still forbidden.
Pero más allá de la inspiración personal, generacional, que Havel dio a muchas personas en mi país,
But beyond that personal inspiration that Havel gave to many people in my country,
ha sido vital la política exterior que él promovió hacia la isla.
the foreign politics that he promoted towards the island was vital for us too.
En esa política que él impulsó de la República Checa hacia Cuba, puso en el centro de atención y en el centro de los reclamos el respeto a los derechos humanos.
In that politics that he had from the Czech Republic to Cuba, he had at the core of this politics the respect to human rights.
Gracias a Havel, el gobierno checo tuvo una política muy activa también, ha tenido todos estos años y esperemos que no cambie. Ha tenido una política muy activa también en la promoción de las fuerzas democráticas dentro de la isla.
Thanks to this very active politics for many years, and I hope this continues in the future, there's been a lot of support to the promotion of democratic forces in the island.
Ese apoyo, ese impulso no fue solamente en discursos y en palabras como hacen tantos, ¿no?
It's not only words, this support, as many people just say in the words, it is more than that.
Sino en realidades.
It is actions, realities.
Por ejemplo, en los años en que la mayoría de las embajadas cerraban la puerta a disidentes y opositores para no entrar en conflictos y en problemas con el gobierno cubano, la embajada checa siempre ha sido un espacio de confluencia y libertad para todos los opositores del país.
During some years, when the embassies used to close the doors, to dissidents and people from the opposition, not to have problems with the Cuban government, the Czech embassy was always a place of freedom and of, where they were accepted.
Cuando muchos países de la América Latina callaban ante los atropellos de los derechos humanos que ocurren en Cuba, la República Checa siempre levantó la voz y yo creo que eso tiene mucho que ver de la inspiración de Havel, ¿no?
When many Latin American countries were silent about the violations of human rights in Cuba, the Czech Republic always spoke out, and that has a lot to do with Havel's ideas.
También Havel fue un hombre puente.
Havel was always also a man who acted as a bridge
entre los activistas dentro de la isla y aquellas personas fuera, protagonistas quizás de otras realidades que no se habían acercado o no conocían lo suficiente de nuestra realidad.
He was a bridge between the activists in the island and the people who were outside the island and did not know our reality well enough.
Se convirtió en un promotor de la causa cubana.
He was a promoter of the Cuban cause.
Por ejemplo, su apoyo a figuras de la disidencia como Osvaldo Payá, del Movimiento Cristiano Liberación, fue trascendental también para dar a conocer los proyectos que estaba haciendo el movimiento y también para brindar alguna mínima protección a los miembros del movimiento del MCL.
His support, for example, to the figure of Osvaldo Payá from the Christian Liberation Movement was very important too, and also granted some protection to the people from this movement.
Esa política exterior de Havel yo creo que también se materializó en la actividad tan intensa que ha desarrollado una organización como People in Need.
These foreign policies of Havel also materialized in the activity of an organization such as People in Need,
que no solamente ha ayudado a denunciar la situación cubana, sino que ha también contribuido a fomentar el activismo, ayudando a formarse y a informarse a los cubanos.
This organization has not only reported the Cuban situation, but also promoted activism in the island.
En los últimos años, y gracias también a la colaboración de organizaciones como People in Need, las fuerzas democráticas, las fuerzas disidentes en Cuba han crecido y se han multiplicado, ¿no?
In the last year, thanks in part to organizations such as People in Need, the dissident forces have grown and have developed in Cuba.
También se han diversificado. Si antes, cuando se hablaba de oposición en Cuba, solo se pensaba en partidos políticos, ahora tenemos muchos fenómenos críticos, disidentes, alternativos, que van desde la música, el performance, el periodismo independiente, los blogs y también, claro está, la oposición política.
And it's also diversified. In the past, it was only political parties in the opposition, but now it's got many different forms that go from music to performance to alternative journalism and to blogs, and of course also to parties in the opposition.
Creo que uno de los grandes legados de Havel es habernos enseñado que la política también se puede hacer de una manera creativa, ¿no? No tiene que ser tan aburrida.
Something very important in Havel's heritage is also showing us how politics can be done in a creative way, not in a boring way necessarily.
Y algo importante es que él sabía lo que estamos viviendo. Él podía comprender lo que vivíamos y trazar estrategias muy acertadas hacia la oposición cubana, porque conocía lo que es vivir bajo un autoritarismo, ¿no?
Something also very important is that he knew what we were living because he had lived it himself, and he knew how to develop strategies to help the opposition of a totalitarian government.
Ayer encontraba yo a unos activistas de Venezuela en el Fórum 2000.
Yesterday I met some activists from Venezuela in Forum 2000.
Y la impresión cuando hablábamos era como si dos pacientes aquejados de una misma enfermedad se encontraran y empezaran a preguntarse cuáles síntomas tienen para comprobar si los dos tienen los mismos síntomas.
The impression I got is as if we were two patients who were suffering the same illness and we were talking and comparing what the symptoms were to see if we had the same symptoms.
Václav Havel había vivido en un país con esa enfermedad, sabía los síntomas.
Václav Havel had lived in a country with the same illness and he knew the symptoms very well.
Y por eso desarrolló una política exterior para ayudar a los cubanos a curarse de la enfermedad del totalitarismo.
That's why he developed a foreign policy to help Cubans cure from this illness of totalitarian government.
Solo espero, y esperamos muchos cubanos de la isla, que las conveniencias económicas, que los problemas internos que también tiene este país, no hagan que decaiga, desfallezca o se debilite lo que ha sido el gran legado de Havel para nosotros.
I just hope that the economic situation and the problems you have in the Czech Republic do not affect this support and do not weaken the support the Czech Republic has given to Cuba.
Nuestra transición ha demorado, pero llegará. Y algún día leeremos El poder de los sin poder sin tener que forrarlo en ningún lugar de Cuba, ¿no?
Our transition has been delayed, but it will come in the end, and one day we will be able to read the power of the powerless without having to cover it with the pages of the newspaper.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you, Yoani. You have illustrated not only your own eloquence, but also, I think, the success of Václav Havel in practicing the value-based approach toward foreign policy, especially in Cuba, that we are studying here. So thank you for illustrating that. Our final panelist is one of the most distinguished figures in the human rights field whom I've had occasion to meet over the years, Lobsang Sangay, who's seated immediately next to me. He is the democratically elected Tibetan political leader. He is based in Dharamsala. He's lectured all over the world on issues of human rights and democracy. He is someone who speaks eloquently on behalf of a struggling human rights and democracy situation, and he will do so here today. So thank you very much, Lobsang. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, John, for your kind introduction. Being the youngest, even though my name was listed the first, I chose to be the last. Being a Buddhist and Asian, I thought I should defer to the wisdom of the elders. At the same time, I have to say the least, because everything about Václav Havel and the value-based foreign policy, all the distinguished panelists have already said, so I have not much left to say. Having said that, let me try to answer John's question. What does value-based foreign policy mean? I think if you look at Václav Havel, you can clearly see him as a rebel, but a realist. Essentially, when he says value-based foreign policy, I think he would say moral and money are both important. But if you have to choose between the two, you will always choose moral over money. I think his life clearly shows that he was a moral warrior. And if you read The Power of the Powerless, you can clearly see it's a prescription for a moral warrior. And Charter 7.7, I think, is a charter for moral revolution, moral and nonviolent revolution. And then maybe I'll try to also touch on a karmic coincidence that he passed away on December 18, 2011, which coincided with the self-immolation by Mohammed Bouazizi in Tunisia, which led to the whole Arab Spring. So I'll try to connect that with Tibet. Now, as for Václav Havel being a moral warrior, and he would choose moral over money. In his first address to the Czechoslovakia, in his first national address, he invited His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Pope John Paul to Czechoslovakia in his national address. That means clearly demonstrating that he is choosing moral over money or power. And then in February of 1990, His Holiness the Dalai Lama came to Czechoslovakia, and I think Václav Havel was the first head of state who invited and hosted His Holiness the Dalai Lama after he won the Nobel Peace Prize. Then was followed by American President George Bush, the father, then by John Major, the Prime Minister of England, and so on and so forth. So Václav Havel took the pioneering step to give weightage, the support to Tibet and His Holiness Dalai Lama by formally inviting him and saying it so in the first national address. Now also, if you read The Power of the Powerless, you can clearly see it's a prescription for moral warrior. Essentially, he breaks down a communist system or totalitarian system. Essentially, he says the leaders at the top have the ideology and system in place. But if down the chain of command and to the lowest level, at the policeman level, actually they follow the ideology and they impose a system not because of conviction, but because of part of the ritual. And that's the weakest point in any system. So hence, and he gives example of greengrocer who choose the signboard outside his shop which says that one should unite for the world power or something like that. Unite the workers of the union. Even though the greengrocer did not believe in the slogan, but he chose to put the signboard outside the shop, mainly because he was following the system and he became the system. But what Václav Havel prescribed is that at that particular moment, one should be moral and choose to revolt against the system. And once you reverse the psychology of fear, then that's how the revolution starts. So that writing was very encouraging and inspiring for me, because given the enormity of China's power, economic and military power, you always look at this gigantic power, and being myself sitting in Dharamsala, sometimes you wonder, and I often ask this question, why did you take this job? It sounds impossible. But then I always say, if you read The Power of the Powerless, you can clearly see how once a seemingly impossible action can be possible in the long run. If I paraphrase Václav Havel, he says that moral act, even it might look trivial at one time, it might look impossible at one time, but it grows in significance eventually and you succeed. That's how when he came out with Charter 77, actually no one believed that it could work, but he took a moral stand And him, along with his friends, drafted the Charter 77, and which became a reality in late 80s. That's how Czechoslovakia and all the Eastern European countries became democratic. Now, Charter 77 has inspired many people around the world, including a Nobel laureate Liu Xiaobo. He and his friends had come out with Charter 08 for China, which is essentially calling for democratic governance for China and plurality, recognizing the plurality and cultural diversity within China so that people can have basic freedom. So Liu Xiaobo is also calling for Chinese people and the international community to be moral and to support the democratic movement in China. And you can clearly see the democratic protest in Hong Kong, the people are choosing to be on the side of democracy, and people are choosing to be moral warrior. So now with Václav Havel's life, unfortunately he passed away on December 18th, 2011. He didn't get to witness the Arab Spring. But on the day he passed away, Mohammad Bouazizi self-immolated himself, he burned himself as a protest. Contrast to greengrocer of the power of the powerless who followed the system and became the system, Mohammad Bouazizi protested the system by burning himself. I'm sure Václav Havel might not endorse the act of self-immolation, but would definitely supported the aspiration of Mohammad Bouazizi and called him a moral warrior. Why I mention this is because in Tibet too, in the last few years, we had 132 cases of self-immolation. 132 Tibetans have burned themselves, and of which 113 have died. So this clearly shows how Tibetans are taking this drastic action. And to sacrifice one's life, one precious life, is not an easy thing to do. But they all are choosing to be, again, a moral warrior. They are choosing not to obey the system and be the system, but rebel the system and send a message across the world that Tibetans are suffering, and what we need is basic freedom. And what we expect also, like the Czech, like Václav Havel, moral supporters from around the world. And the universal slogan of these 132 Tibetans who burned themselves are, they want basic freedom, they want to see the return of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to Tibet. Now, as far as Tibetan administration is concerned, we not only not support the self-immolation, we discourage it. But having said that, we do support the aspiration, because what they want to see is His Holiness the Dalai Lama return to Tibet. And I hope when Václav Havel, in his first national address, welcomed His Holiness Dalai Lama to Czechoslovakia and became the state guest, hopefully calls by self-immolators in Tibet, calling for his return to Tibet, will be realized with the support from people around the world, and hopefully international community and governments, especially people in this room, will choose moral over money and make realize the philosophy of Václav Havel, and his legacy will live on for generations to come. Thank you.
Well, I'm sure our audience can see why it was difficult for me to choose between our final two speakers, and they both spoke very eloquently, as did all the speakers on this panel. And I have a couple of questions of my own, but before I ask them, and I may not, depending on whether panelists have questions that they'd either like to ask each other or comments that they might like to have made in response to what has been said. We have a great range here on the stage of those who are leaders in their own movements, those who are activists and pursuing those movements, representatives of great governments, and leaders of NGOs in the world. So any thoughts that any panelist might have for other panelists? If not, I will ask you a provocative question. But Carl, please.
Well, I really just want to pick up on a point made by Alice Bialiatski and then a point made by Yoani Sánchez. When Alice mentioned the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the cooperation of the autocrats, I think it's important to remember that there is a kind of world movement against democracy. And it really makes it incumbent upon the democracies to unite and to work together more. It's just a very, very important point. Yoani mentioned Osvaldo Paya, who Havel also nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, and they were very close. On January 6, 2012, which was the anniversary of Charter 77 when Havel presented the charter, we held a memorial meeting in Washington for Havel. And to that meeting, Osvaldo Paya sent a beautiful video, a beautiful tribute to memorialize Havel, in which he said, you know, he talked about the fraudulent reforms that were underway. I mention that because we're here in Prague, and 6 months after Paya sent that memorial tribute for Havel, he was killed in an accident, so-called, that the Cuban regime was behind. His car was rammed from behind as he was driving in the eastern part of the island by a car with government plates. And the driver of that car, Angel Caramero, a Spaniard, has come out with a book now describing what happened. They put him on trial and they said it was his fault. He engaged in vehicular manslaughter. But the Cuban government, in my view, was responsible for that. And there needs to be an international investigation, and I want to say that here. The Czechoslovakia and the Czech Republic conducted investigations of the death of Jan Masaryk. Soviets, said it was a suicide, just as the Cubans said this was vehicular homicide. There needs to be an international investigation of the death of Osvaldo Paya. And I believe that were Havel with us today, he would be calling, and not being quiet. In other words, not forgetting that this person, this Havel for Cuba, was killed in an accident in which the Cuban government was probably involved. And I really want to underline that point here because Paya must not be forgotten, especially here in Prague.
Thank you, Carl. That's a very powerful thought as we reach the conclusion of this panel, that while value-based foreign policy need not necessarily be confrontational, it can be very dangerous, and it can be particularly dangerous to those who are engaged on the front lines, many of whom are represented right here on the stage. I have just one question, and then I want to turn to the audience for their questions. And that is, as we look at, it was the one question that I asked that I don't think really got addressed. Understandably, there was so much we were looking at. But as we look at the conflicts in the world today, and particularly circumstances in which people cannot defend themselves from horrific human rights abuses that are taking place, we've seen a history of this, of course, in the whole post-Cold War period, starting with Rwanda and Yugoslavia, and of course now in the most catastrophic way in Syria. And the real question is, what does a value-based international policy call for in this area? The UN has given it a great deal of thought, and there is a doctrine called the responsibility to protect, which calls upon the international community to come and defend those who cannot defend themselves against genocide and crimes against humanity. So the real question is when and where to engage in these kinds of activities. It was something I discussed a great deal with Václav Havel, because at that time NATO was intervening in Kosovo, and Havel was very much supporting that intervention. But it was a difficult call for him, because, of course, there was no support by Russia and the UN Security Council, so it was not done with Security Council approval. So I wonder if anyone on the panel, and maybe just to, focus this particularly on those who have thought about when action should be taken on behalf of human rights when it's being pursued in a value-based international system. If there are no thoughts, I will just put that question. I'm not suggesting that there's an easy answer, but it's something that we have to bear in mind as we look at this value-based foreign policy. Any comment? Ambassador Schapiro.
The only comment I would have with regard to that, and again, this harkens back to the idea that part of what we're called upon to do is act, but the other part is to speak, is that, as you probably remember from your time in your position working for the State Department, in some ways one of the most contentious and challenging things that we face every year is preparing the Human Rights Report that the State Department does, in which it catalogs the supposed sins of every country with which we have relations and those with which we don't. And there is every year some discussion about whether that's productive or constructive, whether it's something to keep doing. And many nations with whom we have very good relationships bridle at this. And they, with some justification, point back at us and say, well, is this the pot calling the kettle black because you yourself, the United States, are imperfect? But I think it's very valuable, and the fact that it's difficult, painful, and arouses objections from all sides means that it's right and it's working. Mm-hmm. It's a small step, but it's something that we take pride in.
Thank you. Any other comments by members of the panel? And if not, I'm going to go to the audience for questions that you may have. Yes, sir, please. And if you would have a microphone here and perhaps identify yourself as you ask your question. Thank you.
My name is Václav Zábranský. I had a great honor and privilege to be personally present more than 24 years ago during the joint session of the United States Congress, when President Havel made his recommendation and pledge to the congressmen and senators of the United States of America, when he said, if you want to help us, please help Russia and Soviet Union. My question to the panelists today, after more than 2 decades, is, what should the United States and the free world, especially the Europe and democracy in this world, do, or what they didn't do during the last 20 years in order to prevent the situation in which world is today, which is quite disturbing situation, and especially in the present Russia. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Who would like to? Carl, please, and then Lobsang.
Thank you for that question. I think there's one thing that we need to do, and that's to defend Ukraine. I think that's the most critical issue today, and I don't think we're doing it. It's not enough to have sanctions. They're fighting a Soviet invasion, a Russian invasion, excuse me, with modern weapons, and they're fighting them with primitive rifles. They need help. And what that means is we need a policy of containment. And we need a policy of containment for 3 large reasons. The first is to help Ukraine. They've got to work to become a democracy, but it's going to be very, very difficult if they're fighting, if they're being defeated militarily and their country is being attacked and divided. The second reason is that I believe that what Putin has done is undermine the world order. So it's a global reason. We're defending the world order. We in the United States cannot say that this is a European problem, because what Putin has done has affected the global order. And finally, if Ukraine can succeed and become a democracy, I think that will be the strongest thing that can happen today to support what Mikhail Khodorkovsky was talking about last night. If you have a country which is largely Russian-speaking, even though they speak both Ukrainian and Russian, people across the border who enjoy freedom and democracy, I think that's going to be the most powerful influence on Russia to move them in a democratic direction that we can have. And I think that's really one of the main reasons Putin is doing what he's doing. He doesn't want to see Ukraine become a free and democratic country. He's worried about a Maidan in Moscow. And I think it is incumbent upon the West and upon the United States to do more to defend Ukraine so that it can become a free and democratic country.
Lobsang, please.
John, more to your original question and a bit on the issue also. Obviously, democracy is universal, and universality of democracy accepted and should be supported by people around the world. That's what Václav Havel he spent his whole life for. For example, the compatibility between Christianity and democracy is established. Compatibility between democracy and Hinduism established if you go to India, and then obviously Shintoism and democracy is also established if you look at Japan. Judaism and democracy also established. Now, again, the Buddhism and democracy is also established if you look at some of the Buddhist countries, from Korea to Japan to Sri Lanka to some extent. Now the question before us is the compatibility of democracy and Confucianism in that sense. That is one of the biggest challenges before us. So I can clearly see, if you look at Taiwan and recent protests in Hong Kong, you can clearly see people want democracy. In that context, I do believe we should support democracy everywhere, and democracy in Ukraine is very important. But to your original question, the universality to protect, and I am for intervention, even though I'm a Tibetan Buddhist, to some extent for humanitarian sake, some kind of even military intervention to prevent larger disaster, larger genocide. We all have to intervene. But I think sometimes we miss one point in the sense, whenever there is a crisis from Ukraine to Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, we get so focused on the recent event and the headlines of the news. But rather, if you're not for all these kinds of violence, even the takeover by Russia, then from the very beginning, we should be supporting nonviolent movements, nonviolent organizations to begin with. Sometimes we'll intervene, let's say in Syria or in Iraq and Afghanistan, violent intervention. But often these are too little too late. But had you supported and encouraged nonviolent movement around the world to begin with, we could have prevented all these violent conflicts around the world. So sometimes we try to address this. So sometimes I feel, looking at the world global interests, the question is nonviolent relevant today? No, looking at the headlines, the international intervention, you almost encourage people to resort to violence to get attention and the support. So that, I think we have to bear in mind. Obviously, we have to talk about the headlines of the day. For example, when I come to Europe, sometimes I feel odd, in the sense, being a student of Western philosophy from Rousseau all the way to Václav Havel, having read about all these things, but you come to Europe and suddenly you realize that Europe is more for money and market than for morals, at least the governments. Then you come to Europe almost to remind Europeans the origin philosophy, origin moral values the countries that you were built on. So it's the oddity that you often face when you come to Europe, to Prague as well.
Thank you. Do we have any further questions before I attempt to summarize what we've discussed? Please. Right, we have one right here, and then we have one over there. Yeah, if we could take first the lady who's standing up. Thank you.
Hi. You were talking about the next generation without any experience, and I am actually the next generation. And I do believe in value-based leadership. So my question is, what value would you choose to spread around the world, apart of freedom? If each of you now would choose one value that you really would like to see around the world more, what kind of value would it be? Thank you.
Thank you. Why don't we take the last question that was being posed to the gentleman here, and then we will ask the panelists to comment. Yeah, please.
Hello, I'm just a regular Polish citizen living here in the Czech Republic, and my question is as follows. You've been talking about the lasting legacy of Václav Havel and of value-based foreign policy, but isn't that a bit of a funeral speech in that the value-based policy is on decline, to put it mildly, and that provided it has ever been prevalent in Europe or Western world, but that's a different question altogether. And the examples are really numerous. The present Czech government has embarked on a project to completely redesign the foreign policy. The friends of Dalai Lama from the past, the Norwegian foreign minister Børge Brende, has refused to meet him, and so did all the other Norwegian government members. They did so a couple of months ago. They couldn't refuse him the access to the country, but they refused to meet him in an attempt to reverse the situation with China when they fall from the grace. And the examples are even more. There is this prevalent wish to go back to the business as usual situation with Russia for what has happened during the recent months. So my question, I guess what I'm trying to ask is, where is the value-based foreign policy today? Because I can't really see a lot of examples of it.
Well, it's a good question.
Are we looking in the past, or are we talking about the present state of affairs?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think what we're doing here on this panel, and we've done it, I think, quite well with the panelists, is to look at the Havel's approach toward foreign policy and international affairs, which is very value-driven, and to see how it reflects current activities in these various countries that we're talking about from the perspective of those who are advocating this approach. You're quite right that there are innumerable examples of the sacrifice of security, of sacrifice of values in the name of security, the sacrifice of values in the name of economic development, the sacrifice of values in the name of trade. We see plenty of examples of that around here today. But the panel is certainly free to comment on any aspect of this, and we have two questions before us. So, Yoani, did you want to go first, please?
Justamente, la pregunta del señor, justamente estamos viviendo en Cuba ahora mismo un proceso de negociaciones entre el gobierno cubano y la Unión Europea, que creo que vale la pena preguntarse si se van a incluir esos valores, ¿no?, en esas conversaciones, o si se están incluyendo esos valores de los que hablábamos de política exterior en esas conversaciones actualmente, ¿no?
Precisely nowadays there's a process of negotiation between Cuba and the European Union, and it would be good to ask ourselves if these values are are included in this negotiation of this value-based foreign policy.
Lamentablemente parece estarse imponiendo un pragmatismo feroz basado más bien en intereses económicos y en no molestar demasiado a la plaza de la Revolución de La Habana, ¿no?
Unfortunately, it seems that the approach is very pragmatic, based on economy interest and on not disturbing the revolution too much.
Como un pastel que ha estado cerrado mucho tiempo a la inversión extranjera, todos calculan qué trozo del pastel cubano podrán llevarse si ahora hablan con el gobierno, negocian y silencian el tema de las violaciones de derechos humanos, ¿no?
It's as if it had been a cake which had been closed to foreign investment. Now that this investment is interested in taking as big a piece as possible, so that's why they're talking with the government and not saying much, silencing the violation of human rights.
Pero es en esos momentos justamente cuando la diplomacia no funciona con valores que la sociedad civil y los movimientos cívicos tienen que recordárselo.
In those occasions when diplomacy does not work with values, those are the times when civil society should be heard.
Y por ejemplo, ahora mismo en Cuba, un grupo bastante representativo de opositores y disidentes han encontrado 4 puntos de consenso que mostrar a la Unión Europea y a otros países del mundo como indispensables a cumplir para cualquier tipo de negociación, conversación con el gobierno, ¿no?
Now, for example, in Cuba, a big group of parties of the opposition and dissidents have found 4 consensus points to show the European Union which are points that should be fulfilled in order to be able to negotiate with the government in Cuba.
Dentro de esos puntos está el fin de la represión, la ratificación de los pactos de derechos humanos, también está la liberación incondicional de todos los presos políticos y el reconocimiento de la sociedad civil. Son los 4 puntos que queremos de alguna manera llevar a esa mesa donde tenemos el temor que el pragmatismo supere a los valores.
The 4 items are the end of repression, the support to human rights,
la ratificación de los pactos,
the ratification of the human rights pacts, also liberating unconditionally the political prisoners, and the final is the acknowledgement of the civil society. Those are 4 items that should be supported.
Yes.
Thank you, Yoani. Anyone else want to comment? Yeah, Lobsang.
Because he mentioned His Holiness Dalai Lama going to Norway. As I was trying to make the larger point earlier, in fact, it's odd that His Holiness the Dalai Lama was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1989. And then just this year, he went to Oslo because the Nobel Peace Institute was hosting an event to celebrate the 25th anniversary of Nobel Peace Prize being awarded to His Holiness Dalai Lama. But the Norwegian leaders refused to meet the Dalai Lama. So after 25 years of His Holiness Dalai Lama continuing with the same mission and vision of nonviolence and freedom throughout the world, he goes back to the place where he was made famous in some sense. But the same leader, they refused to meet with him. Now, of all the countries, Norway is the most economically self-sufficient. Except for salmon, they don't have to sell anything because they are so rich in oil. They have 10% surplus of budget every year. But the power of money of China is so enormous, even the Norwegian government buckled under pressure. It's an oddity. So that's what I was trying to say, that if we believe in the philosophy of Václav Havel, one should have both moral and money. But if there's a clash between the two, one should always choose moral. So that's why you ask the question, what one value that you would choose? I would say moral. Similarly, it's odd that I'm here in Prague. Now, Prague is known for Velvet Revolution, and then the peaceful, non-violent way this struggle went on. But the recent government just made the announcement after visiting China that they do believe in the territorial integrity of China and Tibet being part of China, and they're not going to interfere in the internal affairs of China when it comes to Tibet. Again, it's odd. It was Václav Havel who, in his first national address, invited Dalai Lama, thereby clearly interfering in the affairs because that was the moral thing to do, that was the right thing to do. Now, after 25 years, here we are. Prague and Czech Republic has changed. So where does it lead to? Hence, the bigger question is, it's almost like saying, go for money, don't stand for morals. Now, if you do, then the bigger philosophical question is, who are we? Are we simply a consumer? Are we simply a number? Are we simply a product? Or are we human beings with souls and values? If we are human beings, then the basic foundation of being human is to be free. If you deprive freedom to human being, then you become more like animal. Then, as Václav Havel said, in the communist system, you live in a lie, because that's what the system imposed on you. So if you're human, there has to be some underlying values, like being moral. And once you lose that, you lose becoming a human. Then you lose becoming a human being. Then you simply become a product. Then you simply become a number. Then you simply become a consumer. If that's what humanity is all about, then I think we are betraying the aspirations and all those people who led the struggle in Czech Republic, in Eastern European countries, in the Arab world now. We are betraying the belief and the aspiration. And then you almost force people to take up guns to gain attention, to gain support. If that becomes reality, that's not the world we want to live in. Especially, Europe has been through the First World War and Second World War, and you don't want to go back to that era. You want to make 21st century a century of peace. If that is the case, you really want that way, then you have to be moral and you have to support nonviolent movement. And you have, in that sense, being selfish here, you have to receive His Holiness Dalai Lama. Wherever he goes, he represents the moral value in this present world. Thank you.
Thank you, Lobsang. I think you have very eloquently summarized not only what this panel was attempting to probe, and did probe, I think, quite successfully, but the challenge that we face today as values become more and more overwhelmed by other interests, particularly material interests, but also security interests, which we haven't really spoken about a great deal here, but I think are equally overwhelming of certain types of values that are pursued simply in values that get sacrificed in the name of anti-terrorism or any number of other aspects of security. Let me summarize what I think are the three main points that came out of this panel. As varied as the presentations have been, they've all been eloquent, and they've all, I think, come together around 3 points, not necessarily certainly not from the same perspective, and not always agreeing. I think the first point is Václav Havel did it best, in a sense. The value-based foreign policy and approach toward the world that he projected in his writings, and more importantly in his leadership as a dissident and then as a leader of the Czech Republic when he was the president. I think that is the standard, in a sense, by which we are measuring what we're talking about here today. And I think the three countries where the struggle is ongoing that are represented here, Belarus, Cuba, Tibet, in each in different ways, I think all were addressed in this value-oriented approach by Václav Havel, as you've heard from our three panelists. As Karl Gershman said, values sacrificed for security or for development will result in the loss of values as well as whatever else it is that you're sacrificing them for. And there needs to be an integrated approach. That doesn't mean that one can't also be pragmatic, as Václav Havel certainly was in many of his approaches toward the world. And one needs to be clear in each situation and make careful decisions. Promoting human rights and value foreign policy need not necessarily be confrontational, but at times it may well become so. Then I think the second point was there are clear challenges to this approach today. One challenge we've been articulating, obviously, is the challenge of the material world that is pushing hard globalization and all the other factors that are overwhelming value-based foreign policy or international affairs, as Lobsang has just eloquently so articulated. But so also, I think, are issues of violence, political violence, conflict where people can't protect themselves, the issue of the responsibility to protect. All of these present serious challenges for foreign policy that purports, if it does, to be based on values. The issue of Ukraine is obviously at the core of that. As Karl argued, containment. Others would argue some other form of engagement with Russia. Others might argue a more confrontational approach in terms of arming those in Ukraine. These are all done in the name of values in some context. Obviously, the long discussion that I had over quite a number of months with Václav Havel over Kosovo is another very good example of how one engages beyond simply words with actions to try to protect those who can't protect themselves. And then the final point I think that we all certainly agree on, and in many respects is the theme of this whole conference, is that there is a world movement against democracy in some cases, most cases led by autocrats and by those who are pushing back on democratic values and democratic gains that have been occurring, sometimes within existing democracies, sometimes out on the front lines of democratic struggles. But this needs to be recognized, and that is the reality of today. There is not an ongoing, rather easy, constant transition from the great difficulties and challenges that existed in the past to a democratic future. The transition is facing confrontation with those who are pushing back democracy and human rights. So that, I think, summarizes where we came during the course of this discussion. I want to thank all of our panelists and thank our audience for engaging and letting us know how you feel about some of the statements that were made so eloquent here on the podium. So please join me in thanking all of our panelists.
Thank you.